Salam, I hope you are fine and in good health. This is lecture 12 of our semester 2 syllabus in contemporary US political thought and foreign policy. Our lecture is titled America's Unipolar Moment and the Emerging Multipolar World. In last week's lecture, we looked into the advent of US unipolarism after the end of the Cold War, and with it the cessation of the bipolar world. And we explored how unipolarity developed into a Pax Americana, with the United States turning into an aggressive hegemon. Today, we shall take it from where we left it last week. We shall start by highlighting the major features of American unipolarism and the mechanisms through which the United States aggressively exercised its hegemonic power. We shall also explore what's tipped to be the transition towards a multipolar world, set forth by, quote-unquote, the rise of the rest. And finally, we shall see how the current coronavirus pandemic is affecting the US position in the world, in contrast to that of its major competitor, China. As a dynamic phenomenon, globalization brought forth multidimensional interconnectedness and interdependence of peoples and places at a planetary scale. It, however, gradually became just a new stage in the US-designed world system, which has been at the center of world power relations since the end of the Cold War. The fall of the Soviet Union and the communist model opened up huge economic and financial markets. These led corporate America to expand across the world and to conquer new spaces and new spheres of influence. American products, services, capital, ideas, and lifestyle crossed borders at phenomenal speed to dominate global markets and influence all aspects of life in all parts of the world. The United States didn't hesitate to use its economic and financial superiority as an instrument to exert pressure on other countries through, for example, dumping rates, economic sanctions, blockades, and custom tariffs. The growing interconnectedness of countries and activities, together with the different mechanisms of economic globalization, all worked to the advantage of the United States. Such mechanisms included the internationalization of production and distribution of goods and services, the growth of transnational networks of trade, and the expansion of transborder financial transactions. American multi-billion companies thus developed into gigantic multinational corporations with local affiliates across the world. ExxonMobil, Shell, Nike, Gap, McDonald's, Microsoft, Disneyland, Facebook are just examples of a long list of companies that now dominate global markets and impose American-style consumerism on the rest of the world. The second major process associated with globalization has to do with the formation of transnational media and communication networks. These have set forth the development of globalized media corporations, which today control the global flow of information. The whole global media system is now controlled by something like 10 giant conglomerates, which are predominantly American-owned. The most influential are News Corporation, Disney, Time Warner, Viacom, CBS, and General Electric. The mass media play a key role in the cultural exchanges and multiple flows of information between countries. These are vehicled through international news broadcasts, television programming, new information and communication technologies, film, and music. American culture has an overwhelming global presence, as American television, cinema, and music are now common in all parts of the world, And this has made world cultures increasingly Americanized. This is mainly due to the fact that smaller cultures don't have the means to create a formidable multi-billion-dollar media industry like the one the United States owns. So in the end, the globalized media has brought about some mixed forms of global culture, varying from hybridization to homogenization to Americanization. The new age of information was brought forth by the revolution in the media and communication sectors, which began towards the end of the 20th century and got accelerated in the first decade of the new century. This gave rise to what came to be known as, quote-unquote, the network society. Two major processes contributed to this phenomenon. First, the rapid advances of the new information communication technologies, especially those related to the computer and to the internet. Second, the capitalist reinvention using the innovative applications offered by these new technologies to form a new system dubbed, quote-unquote, information capitalism or, quote-unquote, new economy. This new economy or global economy involves globalized financial markets, globalized trade, the internationalization of production networks, and the globalization of science and technology. Like the other sectors of a globalization, the global network society also works almost exclusively to the advantage of the United States and the wealthy nations. Because of the current global digital divide, the largest majority of countries in the world are either unconnected or disconnected or badly connected by the new technological networks. Poor countries actually almost totally feel excluded from the benefits of this so-called new society. Hopefully in our next semester's course, Media and Globalization, we shall have an in-depth look into the monopoly the United States has over the network society and the interdependent relationship between globalization and media. The period between 1990 and 2010 was a period of tremendous American military interventionism in all parts of the world and for all kinds of motives. The end of the Cold War ideological divide aroused a lot of hopes for an era of cooperation between countries, an era of peace and of prosperity for all. Unipolarity is often presented in scholarly studies as non-violent, and a number of theoretical premises went as far as presenting the United States unipolar moment as, quote-unquote, the age of promise and the age of peace. Those premises were, however, soon proven wrong by a series of American-instigated wars and military operations in different parts of the world. The United States was actually at war for 12 of the 20 years that followed the end of the Cold War. America's targeted victims were all smaller countries which had mostly lost the protection of what we might call the security sponsor, the Soviet Union. By the same token, the United States went all lengths to avoid going to war with big powers or with smaller countries which happened to have nuclear weapons, such as North Korea. The decade of that era was to kick off with yet another devastating American war against Iraq, known as the First Gulf War. The Pentagon dubbed it Desert Storm. President Bush Sr. jubilated at the victory of the United States, which was actually brought about with the help of a strong 30-country coalition against a third world country. We kicked off the Vietnam syndrome, he bragged. Yet, both at home and abroad, people were skeptical. Because 12 years later, in 2003, another Bush, his son, would thrust the United States into a Vietnam-style quagmire in the same country, Iraq. So what lessons can we draw from this war, this first Gulf War? In fact, despite the readiness expressed by the Iraqis to accept a diplomatic settlement, the United States pushed ahead with its war plan. It preferred to use the war to showcase its latest innovations in military hardware: smart bombs, Tomahawk missiles, Apache helicopters, and so on. The war was an opportunity for Washington to announce to the world, and with a bang, the advent of its unipolar moment, and to alert its European allies lest they got tempted to try to get loose from American control. This is especially that the raison d'être for the US heavy presence on the continent seemed to have disappeared now that the Soviet Union and its threat was a thing of the past. The war finally turned out to be a showcase of America's technological superiority. The world had never witnessed a war being broadcast live on TV like a video game, or to one fought with computer-guided weaponry. Yet, despite all that display of formidable force, the United States had only acted as a mercenary of the rich Gulf sheikdoms, which took charge of its war bills. America's real agenda was to have total control over the oil resources. Controlling the strategically important Gulf and Middle East regions was key to implementing its agenda, and ward off any threats from a recovering Russia or a rising China. American foreign military interventions were to be pursued by the following administrations. Under Bill Clinton, the United States launched a series of military operations, mostly without UN approval, in Somalia, Haiti, Serbia, Afghanistan, El Salvador, and Libya, amongst others. Under George W. Bush Jr., especially following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the United States was to turn into a dangerously aggressive hegemon, both in rhetoric and in action. It triggered two ruthless wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, causing enormous human and material devastation. The catastrophic repercussions of these two wars are still being felt today, not just in the United States, but also across the world. The United States went to war against Iraq in 2003 without a mandate from the United Nations, on the claim that Baghdad had weapons of mass destruction, but in the end, no such weapons were found. Many countries, including America's own allies, deplored its roguish conduct and threat to global peace. To them, it was immoral to fight a unilateral war against a sovereign country, especially that other options were already at work, including the UN Protocol of Nuclear Inspection. The American unipolar moment started to lose its steam in the first decade of the new century because it was turning too aggressive. The United States had an historic opportunity after the end of the Cold War to rise above its self-centered narrow agenda and endeavor to erect a new world system based on cooperation with the rest of the world and mindful of other countries' national interests and preoccupations. To the contrary, however, the United States chose to antagonize the rest of the world, often contradicting its own declared foundational values and principles. The rise of new powers capable of competing for global influence, coupled with America's disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, its financial crisis, and its failed management of the current coronavirus pandemic, have added heat to the debate about America's global position in the new millennium. At the center of this debate, there is the question of whether the United States has entered an era of irreversible decline, following the natural trajectory of other empires before it. Or is it the case that this idea of decline is just a myth? And is it true that the US position in the world hasn't really depleted, and that the United States is now just sharing more of its assets with other countries? These are questions that we shall try to answer in a minute. The proponents of the first view, like Paul Kennedy, consider that empires tend to overstretch and then decline. They argue that by the end of the first decade of the new millennium, America's unipolar moment started to dissipate, to gradually give way to multipolarity in world power relations, as the rest of the world started to gain more and more ground. To them, the United States has overextended its resources, its debt reaching unprecedented levels, its infrastructure getting exhausted, its competitors catching up pretty fast, its share of the world economy shrinking, its productivity weakening, and its middle class struggling. Added to that, it occupies the gruesome third position amongst the developed countries in terms of inequality of income. The proponents of the opposite view, on the other hand, consider that the United States is still a powerful country in terms of both hard power and soft power. With regard to hard power, the United States still has formidable economic and financial assets and incomparable military capabilities. To them, it's still the locomotive of the global economy, with a GDP estimated at $15 trillion, representing at least 25% of the world's GDP. And it has kept this ratio for at least 4 decades. It's argued that China's GDP growth has been at the expense of the declining GDP of Europe, and not as a result of that of the United States. American companies and brands are still globally omnipresent, and the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Militarily, the United States is still by far the most powerful power in the world. Its defense budget is estimated at $600 billion, representing almost 50% of the world's military spending. And it has at least 1,000 military bases in the 4 corners of the world. Its universities and colleges continue to outclass those of other countries. It's actually host to 17 of the top 20 universities in the world, and 70% of the world's Nobel Prize winners both live and work in the United States. But while the United States is still number 1 in every aspect of power, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future, it nonetheless no longer enjoys the same supremacy it used to enjoy, say, 2 decades ago. This is mainly because of the rise of alternative powers capable of competing with it for global influence. No doubt, the world is currently undergoing profound and complicated transformations at all levels and in all fields. We are actually witnessing a shift in power relations. By the end of the first decade of the new millennium, there started a transition from America's unipolar moment to a multipolar world, as it continued to lose ground and to lose in reputation. As it's shown on the Gallup chart here, the world's US leadership approval, especially since Donald Trump became president, has actually reached a record low. This transition from an era of unipolarism to an era of multipolarism is actually characterized by the rise of a number of powers which are tipped to become America's major competitors in the 21st century. Top on the list we find the BRIC countries: China, Russia, India, and Brazil. The European Union could also potentially play an active role in the emerging multipolar world order, provided that it overcomes its political woes. China has certainly developed into a formidable economic power, capable of competing with the United States for the number 1 position. Can it, however, develop into an equally formidable military power capable of challenging the United States, which currently has undisputed global military supremacy? That's the big question. And in terms of soft power, can China come close to the global cultural influence the United States still enjoys? That's another big question. The power shift the world is currently going through doesn't necessarily mean America will immediately be dislodged from its global position by the newly emerging superpowers. It still remains an enormously wealthy and resourceful power. Despite its phenomenal growth, especially economically, China will not be able to displace the United States from the number 1 position, at least in the foreseeable future. It itself has serious difficulties to remedy. demographic, structural, and environmental. All the other rising powers have similar shortcomings to attend to. Russia is certainly a formidable military power, but economically it still has a very long way to go to catch up with both the United States and China. And the European Union is facing an acute multidimensional crisis, political, economic, and structural. According to a number of estimates, the United States is still leading the show in many vital sectors. And it will continue to have the world's biggest economy, the strongest army, and the most influential culture for at least 2 or 3 decades. But in this period of transition towards a multipolar world, the United States will have to learn to live as a power amongst other powers. It should come to terms with the reality that it won't be able to call the shots as it used to. It shouldn't miss the opportunity to embrace a policy of accommodation and reconciliation with the rest of the world, especially with fast-growing countries like China, and to endeavor to contribute to solving the world's problems and not to aggravating them. It has to learn to accept the emergence of a new world order system anchored on the international institutions, on the UN Charter, and also on the vital principle of balance of power in order to preserve peace and security for all nations, great or small. By the same token, it has to abandon its old new strategy to contain rising powers, to eventually push them into confrontation or perhaps into Cold War. The signs that are actually coming from the Trump administration's handling the current coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent mounting tension in America's relations with the rest of the world, especially with China, are not really encouraging signs. The current COVID-19 pandemic has plunged the world economy into serious crisis and world power relations into tension, distrust, and even animosity. By all accounts, the United States under Trump has so far failed to offer leadership which the world badly needs and expects from the most powerful country in the world at a time of a ravaging pandemic. It has failed to swiftly contain the pandemic at home, contrary to other countries, especially China. And the economic fallout of the crisis and its impact on its job market has already been disastrous. The pandemic has shown that the United States under Donald Trump is either unwilling or unable, or perhaps both, to provide global leadership in a way that would help shepherd a global common response to the crisis. Its retreat from the international arena and refusal to coordinate with other countries and with the World Health Organization to combat the pandemic has left a big leadership vacuum which China has voluntarily jumped to fill. The pandemic has provided China with an enormous opportunity to showcase its leadership qualities to the world, despite the distrust it is facing in some countries and amidst the suspicion that it initially attempted to cover up the spread of the virus. According to experts, China is using the pandemic to increase its worldwide political, financial, and soft power influence, sharing data and expertise with other countries, sending medical experts, equipment, and supplies to countries in the 4 corners of the world, including some EU countries, freezing loan repayments by debtor countries, and sponsoring a huge vaccine development program. While the United States will certainly remain the leading power in global finance for the foreseeable future, its current COVID-19 financial political woes show that it's losing ground very fast to its major competitor. So are we heading towards a new Cold War, this time between China and the United States? My answer, that's quite unlikely. The financial and economic interconnectedness that binds them together is so strong that neither China nor the United States would be willing to provoke a suicidal and damaging Cold War like that of the last century between the United States and the Soviet Union. For both America and China, the difference with the Soviet Union is pretty striking. The US imports from the Soviets were estimated at not more than $200 million. By contrast, the US current imports from China are estimated at the impressive figure of $900 billion. And thereby hangs a tail, as the expression goes. As you recall, at the beginning of the semester, and as part of the homework assignment essay, you were instructed to read the three major works of Paul Kennedy, Robert Kagan, and Fareed Zakaria. Today, your assigned reading includes two major journal articles, which I have made available for you on the platform. This is it for this week and for this semester. Good luck and stay safe.